good evening, and welcome to part 3 of our webinar series, Risk Mitigation in the Pharma QC Laboratory. My name is Isabelle Dutrieux, and I will be your host for this session. It is my pleasure to welcome Neil Lender from Waters Corporation, who will discuss creating efficiency in your routine LC workflow with simple automation steps in Empower. Before I hand it over to Neil, here are a few pointers to help you navigate the webinar platform. There is a Q&A box, and we invite you to use it to enter your questions. We will take time at the end of Neil's presentation to address your questions. One question we often get is about accessing the presentation after the webinar. So please be reassured, as a webinar registrant, you will receive an email within 48 hours with a link to the webinar recording of the session. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you will also find a survey. Your feedback is very important to us, and we would definitely appreciate it if you could take the time to complete the survey before logging out today. So the topic of the day is really one of the most requested topics, one of your favorite topics. It's about creating efficiency in your LC routine workflow within Empower. Our presenter, Neil Lender, is the Principal Product Manager within our informatics group at Waters Corporation. Neil has actually been working for Waters Corporation for almost 30 years in a variety of positions. Currently, he provides internal support for Empower CDS, and he's focused on developing lab software solutions that help organizations achieve their scientific and operational objectives. Welcome, Neil, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Isabelle, and welcome to everyone. We really appreciate your taking time to join us for this webinar, and we hope that you'll find it informative. So as the title indicates, how can we streamline the workflow in the quality control laboratory to help reduce risk? If we can automate things as much as possible and eliminate some of the human intervention, we can reduce the chance that errors may be made. Now, it's really two things. It's developing a streamlined SOP, but also then taking advantage of the tools within the software to make this streamlined SOP translate into a streamlined actual working process in the laboratory. So some of the topics that I'd like to touch on, and we'll go through these. When we look at starting up the instrument, how can we automate the startup of the instrument, not only to make the workflow smoother, but to lessen the burden on the person in the laboratory who may need to go and do other things rather than stand in front of the instrument to do the priming and the purging and so forth. System suitability is such an important topic, and it is one that could decide whether we continue with our run for the day or we stop if system suitability doesn't pass. So could we automate some of the system suitability checking, again, to make the workflow a little smoother for us and simplify that workflow? Now, once we have our data, of course, we need a processing method, as we call it in Empower, where we define the peak detection and integration parameters. And some chromatograms, if it's an assay, may be a very nice big peak for an API. But if we have an impurity method or other types of methods, then we need to set up optimum values for peak widths and thresholds and so forth and so on. And there I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Apex track algorithm that's built into Empower. We know that chromatography isn't perfect, and sometimes from injection to injections peak move, and to some degree we can live with that. But if the retention times of the peaks are fluctuating too much, then they may not be identified and they're not quantitated. So what tools can we use to prevent that from happening? We have a lot of calculations that we need to make, perhaps more than just the default calculations of an internal standard calibration or an external standard calibration. Maybe we need to do a percent agreement, or we want to determine if something passes and fails and make it very simple to the data reviewer that it passes or fails. So how can we automate all of the calculations within Empower, eliminating the need to take the data out of Empower, go somewhere else to do the calculations, and then bringing it back into Empower to make the final report. And the data review process itself. It's probably one of, if not the biggest bottleneck in the laboratory today. With fast chromatography and so many instruments in the laboratory, there's so much data to review. Is there a way we can speed that up and make it more efficient? And then looking at trends in data long term to prevent potentially an OOS from occurring. I'm also adding to the discussion because we released a new HPLC this year. We just recently released a new version of Empower software, that's 3.8.0. And again, along the lines of reducing risk, preventing errors from occurring. So we have some new column technology. I'd like to talk a little bit about column tracking and history. We have the ability to set up pre-run and runtime checks so that if you go to start a sample set, it will check several things on the instrument before it proceeds, and then also enhancing the audit trails with more detailed information about the system itself. So that being said, let's begin. And we have a number of functions in the sample set method to make it a little bit easier to prepare the system in the morning. And we can build this into the sample set method. And let's get a closer look here on this slide. For example, we can equilibrate the system, purge the injector, condition the column, and we can build it into the sample set method so that once we start that sample set method running, it would automatically go through these steps. System suitability. We have something in Empower called interactive system suitability. Now, how does that work and where might you be able to use that? So everyone does system suitability. It's very important. And regardless of what your system suitability testing consists of, whether it's looking at percent RSD for area after replicate injections of a standard, whether it's the measurement of resolution between a critical pair of peaks, whatever it happens to be, we have to stop, evaluate system suitability. If it passes, then we can continue on with our samples. But if it fails, then we have to stop and we have to document the failure and determine the cause of that failure before we can proceed. Now, some people that I've spoken to do system suitability first, up front. If you do it that way, what you could potentially do is what you see on the slide here, and that is to put the system into run and process mode, but only have normal processing for the system suitability sample. Everything else would be do not process or report. So we only have normal processing for the system suitability sample. Then, through the processing method, we can set up limits and things that the results of syssuit would be compared to. If it passes, then the system would proceed to the next line in the sample set method. But if it fails, you notice at the top, I have it set to stop on fault. If it fails, if the system suitability sample fails, it would stop the instrument from injecting, and we could even set it up in such a way that it would then lower the flow rate on the pump in case you wouldn't be able to get back to the lab in time to begin the investigation of why it failed. So this is a way of automating the decision-making process depending on what happens with syssuit. Now, others I've spoken to say, unfortunately, we can't do that because we have system suitability samples throughout the run. In that case, you would need to obviously complete the run and then evaluate system suitability. So peak detection and integration. And there are actually two algorithms in Empower. The one that I wanted to talk about is apex track peak detection. Now, this may fall in more with method development or perhaps method validation. But with the apex track algorithm, it makes it easier to set up the critical parameters, which are peak width and detection threshold. Those two parameters affect how peaks are detected in Empower. And actually, the way peaks are detected in Empower are from the second derivative of the chromatogram. So what happens is you define a start and a stop area. I want to integrate, I want to detect and integrate peaks from 2 to 6 minutes. And you just click the integrate button. And then it will determine the optimum peak width and detection threshold for that region. And it will display it in review for you. And the automatic detection of peak width is taken from the largest peak in the second derivative of the chromatogram. And the auto threshold, or the detection threshold that's automatically determined, is actually the peak-to-peak noise within the second derivative of that chromatogram. So the optimum values are determined and displayed within review. Now, you can further optimize those. There are, of course, timed events in the processing method if you needed to adjust the peak width because perhaps later in the chromatogram you have a very wide peak. That, of course, is available. But it makes it easier to set these parameters up the first time you go through. Now, one of the things about Apex Track is that it decouples the detection part from the integration part. So once we've detected our peaks, we need to draw baselines under those peaks so that we can get areas and heights and retention times and so forth. So there are two separate parameters that control how those baselines are drawn in, and how that baseline is determined is detailed here on the slide, but essentially it uses a percentage slope threshold. So the slope threshold really depends on the peak height. Tall peaks will have big thresholds, small peaks will have small thresholds, but the key here is that it will integrate consistently. So if you're going over a rather wide range of concentration for an analyte, it will integrate those peaks consistently. Now, how does this work? So what happens is there are two parameters in the processing method, liftoff percentage and touchdown percentage. They're on the integration tab within the processing method. And what initially happens is Empower draws a baseline at the inflection points of the peak. And then it calculates the two angles that you see here in the slide. And the way it determines where the peak starts is according to the equation, delta M1 times liftoff percentage divided by 100. So liftoff percentage, the default value is 0, and the allowable range is 0 to 100. If I put in 100, then it would be delta M1 times 1. So essentially, the peak start would be at the inflection point, which is probably not what you want, but it's allowable. If I put in 0 for the liftoff percentage, then 0 times delta M1 is 0. So the baseline for this peak is going to start somewhere down in the baseline noise. So it's a very simple parameter to adjust. So if you feel that the peak is starting or stopping too far away from the peak, you can raise these values. If you feel that it's starting too far in the peak, then you can lower these values. It's a very simple parameter to adjust. Now, as I mentioned earlier, chromatography is not perfect. And we do our best to get a method that's very robust, where from injection to injection, the retention times are reproducible. Now, of course, there is some plus minus, and we can live with that, as long as those peaks stay within a certain retention time window, they're identified, and then we can quantitate those peaks. So there are a variety of different tools that we can take advantage of in the processing method to account for this shift in retention time. Now, if the shift in retention time is very significant, it's probably time to take a look at, do I have a problem with my instrument? Do I have a problem with the column? Perhaps it's an old method and it really needs to be revised and revalidated. But let's concentrate on some of the tools that we have available to us. Perhaps the simplest tool is simply adjusting the retention time window, which you can do on a peak-by-peak basis. So here's an example. Of course, it's a fairly simple one, but here we've got 4 peaks in a standard, and they're all identified properly. Here's a chromatogram for a sample, and the third peak, although we can see it, and it's pretty close to the retention time that we've expected. It is outside of the retention time window, and you can see that it is labeled as an unknown, whereas the actual peak is listed as missing. So one of the tools that we can take advantage of is we can use an RT reference peak. So really the necessity or requirements for the RT reference peak should be that it's reasonably well separated from everything else. And then you could widen up the retention time window for that reference peak. And it must be in every chromatogram. That's a given. It's got to be in every chromatogram, otherwise it's not going to work. So here we are in the Components tab of the processing method, and for peak 3, we are selecting peak number 2 as our retention time reference peak. Here's the calculation that Empower makes. So it's a temporary calculation for the expected retention time. The retention time listed in the components table will not change. And you can see the calculation is the retention time of the component in the calibration curve multiplied by the ratio of the retention time of the reference peak divided by the retention time of the reference peak in the calibration curve. Okay. And now we can see once we use that, the peak is identified properly and will be quantitated. Now, another tool that we could take advantage of is rather than identifying peaks by absolute retention time, we have the ability to identify peaks by relative retention time. How does that work? So if we go into the processing method, we can actually put in the relative retention time. It will automatically blank out or remove the absolute retention time, and it will use that relative retention time to identify that peak. Now, what you'll find is when you use the RT reference peak, which is what we were talking about before, it will automatically calculate RRT for your peak. So you'll know very quickly what is the relative retention time of the peak of interest. And here again is the calculation that it makes. It takes the relative retention time of the component times the retention time of the reference peak, and it sets up, again, a temporary retention time window, retention time and window to look for that peak. You won't see any change in the component table itself. It's used to determine the location of that peak, and it is now found. You can see there's the RRT. Sorry, the screen capture is a little bit small. And now the peak is identified and quantitated. So again, we know there can be movement of peaks, shifting of retention times from injection to injection, perhaps even over long sample set methods this can occur. But there are some tools in Empower that you can take advantage of to make sure that the peaks are identified and quantitated. This way, it requires less manual intervention once all of the data has been collected and processed. So we have a lot of calculations to make. And while Empower itself makes a lot of calculations by default, everybody has their own very specific calculations that they must make as part of the assay or the impurity method or the dissolution method that they may be running. So we have the ability to create tailored calculations, or we call custom fields. The advantage to doing this is all the calculations are done within Empower. So you stay within that compliant envelope, if I can use that expression, of Empower. We don't need to take things out of the software, make the calculation, and perhaps bring the results back in, and then generate the final results. So we have the ability to make custom calculations. We call them either custom peak fields or custom result fields. We can enhance decision making by taking advantage of things such as Boolean and enumerated data types, which we can take a numerical result and translate it into a pass-fail, for example. Then we can also track and trend those results based on those custom fields, and of course they can be included in the reports. So, all right, this may be a little bit harsh. I use Excel too, but a lot of people like to use Excel. The problem with Excel is there's no audit trail in Excel. And you can sort of lock it down, but you can easily unlock it. So we want to make sure that we're doing everything in a compliant way in the QC lab of a pharmaceutical company. So if we make a custom field, now this is just a very simple custom field where we're taking the area ratio of one peak to another peak. I should say, when custom fields are created, they do need to be validated. We have to make sure that they're working properly. So here we can see in review, here's the result of that area ratio. So we can see it first in review. We can also take these custom fields a step further. Something simple like the percent area. What if the percent area of a certain peak has to be greater than or equal to a particular value? That's part of your method. How can we get Empower to evaluate that for us? So what we can do is we can use Boolean logic. And all Boolean logic is doing is answering a yes/no question. Does this field meet this parameter that we set up? Very simple. Okay? So here we have, does the percent area of a particular peak, is it greater than or equal to this value? Yes or no? And we can take the 0 and the 1, it says no, yes, and we can translate that into pass, fail. Something simple so it can be interpreted. We don't have to worry about the numbers as much. So here we can see an example where something is passing. And here we see an example where something is failing. And you can also then turn around, go to the Limits tab in the processing method, and select one of these custom fields if you want the failing value to be highlighted in the bold red italicized font that many of you are used to. We can also see, for example, within the Peaks tab of the project window, what's passing or failing, because now we've got that custom field. We've added it to a custom view filter here. It's really, I just added sample evaluation to a default filter, and now it's showing me which ones are passing and which ones are failing. And of course, we can add this to the report as well. The sample at the top passes, the one at the bottom fails. Now, data review. Again, probably one of the biggest bottlenecks in the laboratory today because we're generating so much data and so many results. How do we review these results in an efficient way? Well, one of the things that we could do to help and streamline the process is by the use of a combination of view filters and also custom fields. We can use Empower to flag results that will require some further review. So here's just a simple example. We're looking at methods, and in some laboratories, I know that processing methods may be locked down. So the QC chemist cannot modify that method. If that's the case, and we wanted to know which methods are locked or not locked, we can go to the Methods tab, and we can add this method locked field, which will simply automatically put a check mark in the box for any of those methods that are locked. Now, in this case, you can see there is a field called exception review. That's a custom field that was created. And regardless of the math behind it, what comes out of this is, you can see in all cases here, all of these results require further review. So especially where we've got a huge result set, we have so many results to look through, it would make life a little easier if the software could automatically flag those results that do require review, and we would have to set up what are those parameters. You know, is the channel locked after it's processed? Has the result been signed off? Has the sample been altered? Things like that. Do I have more than 5 results for this particular sample? Why so many results? So we can define which of those parameters are critical and boil that down to a custom field that will say, one or more of those parameters have failed. This one requires further review. Right. And this is just a snippet without going into all the details, but again, it's just using the Boolean logic, and it's looking at some of the parameters that we've set to see, is it okay? Or is there something out of a number of different parameters that don't meet our requirements? If so, then it's going to return requires further review. So long-term tracking of data and looking for trends in data could potentially help in preventing OOS. Now, we're looking at a screen capture from the limits tab in the processing method. And I made mention earlier in the discussion that you can set up limits for various peak fields. They can be custom fields, they can be standard fields. So, anything from area to, in this case, you're looking at custom fields. Set up target values, lower error limits, and upper error limits. You can also set up warning limits. If a numerical value exceeds an error limit, that's when Empower is going to flag it, and a couple of things will happen. You will see in review, for example, in the peaks table, that peak name in that field will be in bold red italicized font. It will also flag that result as a faulted result because you've exceeded a limit. But we can also use the information that you set here in a control chart. In a control chart is really nothing more than a visual of results over time. And we can pick from any number of parameters to plot. So in this case, we're looking at run number versus percent RSD of peak areas. And you'll notice on the control charts, and by the way, control charts are summary reports in Empower. That's all they are. And if you go into the report publisher, on the lower left-hand side of all the report groups, under the system suitability groups, you'll find several different formats for control charts. They automatically, by default, will display any target values and any other limits that you've set in the processing method for that peak, for that particular peak parameter. So in this case, you can see the target value is here. Obviously, the lower the percent RSD, the better. The upper warning limit is here, which doesn't trigger anything, but provides a visual. We're tracking nicely, and then suddenly in these two runs, the percent RSD is higher. Why? What would trigger the fault again is if it exceeded this upper error limit that you see in red. Okay. Here's another example where we're looking at a run versus the percent impurity. Very important for routine monitoring when we're doing an impurity method. So again, an upper limit has been set, an upper warning limit has been set. There's no target value in this case, but we're looking at that percent impurity over time. Okay, so these are some of the tools that we can take advantage of to streamline the process, make the process a little simpler, remove some of the human intervention that may be needed. Now, of course, if something is flagged as requires review, obviously then we have to go in and we have to take a look at that result. So we took this a step further. In our new version of Empower that we released in June, that's 3.8.0. And earlier this year, we introduced a new HPLC called the Alliance S.A.S. And what we did was, in this new version of Empower, we built some functionality into Empower to work specifically with this instrument to prevent errors from occurring, right? So here's a couple of scenarios. I go into the laboratory, I install a column into the HPLC. It's not the correct column that the method calls for. I start running, somebody realizes, or maybe it's at the end of the day after all the samples have been run, I've got the wrong column. Now we can't use any of the day's work. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a system by which you install the column, you tell the system to start the sample set, It does a quick check to make sure you've got the right column installed as per the method. If it's wrong, it doesn't run the sample set and you get an error message. It's things like that. Okay, so speaking of columns, let's talk a little bit about columns and column technology. So back in 2004, we introduced the Acuity UPLC. And then we introduced the E-chord columns, the Acuity E-chord columns. And for those of you that are familiar with this, it's a column that has it looks like a piece of wire attached to it with a magnetic disc on the end. And what happens is when you install that column and you attach that magnetic disc to the side of the instrument reads key information from that column. The name of the column, the part number, the serial number, and about 13 fields of information get read. Empower then reads that information and stores that information permanently. There's no human intervention. So at the end of the day, if somebody says, well, what column did you use to make this injection? You can show them without a doubt, this is the column that I used. Now we fast forward to this new instrument that we released, the Alliance IS, and we were looking for a different type of technology. And what we've come up with is RFID. So we have these eConnect columns that have a tag on them. You put the column in the column oven, you close the door. Through RFID technology, the information on the tag is read. Again, Empower then reads the information from the system, and it permanently stores 13 fields of information so that, again, there's no doubt without any human input, what column did I use? So this version of Empower will support both the E-chord technology, because there are a lot of customers using Acuities with E-chord, and the new eConnect columns that go with the Alliance IS. So yeah, apologies, a little bit of a small screen capture, but you'll have a copy of the slides. Here we are in Configuration Manager. Now, this is a brand new instrument that I was using. So there was only one column at this time connected. And I go to the column view and it shows me this is the column that's been installed on this instrument. I can also change that view to look at what sample sets were run on that column. Then what we've done here in Empower 3.8.0 is we took it a step further and we said the following. If I right-click on one of the sample sets and select View as Sample Set, it will open the project where the sample set lives. And that's a new feature. And this will work for both the E-chord columns as well as the eConnect columns on this new version of Empower. So it'll take you right into the project where that sample set lives. Now, when we talk about column tracking, there's a lot of discussion about column tracking. What does that really mean? Well, we're tracking the performance of the column over time. Well, how are we going to measure that? Well, like system suitability, it could be a number of things. You might have a standard set of conditions. You could be looking at the USP plate number, resolution between a critical pair of peaks, could be a number of different things. So what we can do to begin, before we make a control chart, as I showed you earlier, we can go into the project window. Here I've selected the injections tab, and we can make a custom view filter. And in this case, I added two fields, the column name and the column serial number. You can select more than those two fields to make a custom filter. But now I'm looking at and saying, okay, I see I've used this column with this serial number for these injections. And you could make the view filter even more specific by creating one to look at a particular column serial number. It's automatically detected, and then we could look for that specific column. Right. Now, I made mention earlier of pre-run checks in Empower. How can we prevent errors from occurring? How can we prevent somebody from, unfortunately, perhaps wasting quite a bit of time collecting data where you had the wrong column or the instrument was out of service or who knows what? And that's what these pre-run checks are all about. So here's a list of some of the things that with Empower 3.8.0, it's going to check with this new HPLC, right? Do I have the right plate installed? There's a camera that actually reads the barcode on the plate in the auto sampler. Do I have the vials in the right positions? So I set up a sample set method, put in the vials. The system will actually go and check before you start the sample set running. Are the vials in the right spot? Is the preventive maintenance up to date? Is the qualification up to date? Is the calibration up to date? If we've exceeded those dates, we don't want to collect data on that instrument. The column check is one that I mentioned briefly a little earlier in the discussion. So with the instrument method for the Alliance IS, you can put in which column you're using for that method. Then what happens is when you actually install the column in the column oven with that eConnect tag, it reads the column. And if you start the sample set, it's going to do a comparison. Is the column installed? Does it match what you specified in the instrument method? Yes or no? If yes, then it's going to proceed. If no, it's not going to start and you'll get an error message. What about the solvent level? Maybe I don't have enough solvent in one or two of the bottles on the instrument. If it's too far down in the level, we're not going to be able to complete all the samples. Has the solvent expired? We can put expiration dates in for the solvents as well. So these are part of the checks that the system is going to do when you click start to run a sample set to prevent any errors from occurring and then unfortunately time being wasted after all the data has been collected. Then we have to write up a report. We have to make an investigation as to what happened, and we can't use the data that we've collected. Okay. We've also enhanced the system audit trail in Configuration Manager when there are modifications to the configuration of this instrument. So there's a bit more detailed information if you look at the system audit trail within the Configuration Manager window. Okay, so with that, I think we have time for questions.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Neil, for your presentation. We will now move to the Q&A part of the webinar today. So we'll start with the first question, and I will push it to the slide areas that we could all see it. Yes, okay. So the first question is, Neil, you mentioned interactive system suitability earlier in your talk. One of our criteria is that the percentage RSD for peak area after multiple injections must be less than or equal to 2%. How do I set that up?
Okay, that's a great question. And actually, this comes up quite a bit. So we have the ability to make a peak custom field, but an intersample peak custom field, meaning we're going to calculate across samples. And we have a percent RSD function, mathematical function built into our custom field wizard. So you can make a custom field to calculate the percent RSD for the area for your replicate injections. I know typically it's 5 or 6 injections. And then what you would have to do is go into the limits tab of the processing method. And for whatever peak you're looking at, select the peak and then select the custom field. And then you can set in the upper error limit of 2%. So it's 2 pieces. It's making a very simple custom field to get the percent RSD calculated, and then modifying the processing method by putting that in the limits tab, selecting the custom field and putting in the upper error limit. Now, just as an aside, because I've had this question related to this one is, well, in the report publisher, if we make a summary report, it calculates percent RSD. That's true, but that's only within the report. That number is not, you can't access that number to do anything with it. So that's why if you make this very simple custom field, it'll calculate and permanently store the percent RSD, and you can set limits against it. So thanks, because that's a good follow-up to that discussion on interactive system suitability.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the answer.
What do we have next, Isabel?
Okay, so the next question is about autopic. Okay, is it acceptable to use autopic width and
Okay.
detection threshold for every
Is it
chromatogram?
acceptable to use auto peak width and detection threshold for every chromatogram? Ooh, this is a good question. Um, I would not advise that, and I understand where this question is coming from. So as we had the discussion at the very beginning about Apex Track, so again, you set up your time range, you click integrate, it automatically detects the optimum peak width and detection threshold for the chromatogram. Potentially, you could go to the next chromatogram and click integrate, and it's going to determine the optimum peak width and detection threshold for that chromatogram. So you could end up with a series of results and different peak widths and detection thresholds for every chromatogram. I don't think that would be acceptable in a QC environment. So what I recommend doing, and again, this goes back more to the method development stage, is once you've determined what that optimum peak width and detection threshold is, you can hard code that into the processing method so that it uses a consistent peak width and detection threshold to process all the chromatograms. And it's really very simple. You know, when you're in review and you see that optimum peak width or optimum detection threshold, you right click on it and there's an option that says copy to processing method and you're done. All right. So be careful. I think in a QC environment, you want to have a peak width and a detection threshold hard coded into that processing method so that you process consistently.
Exactly,
Okay.
processing consistency.
What do we have next?
Very important. And I want to remind the audience that there is still time to enter questions in the Q&A box on your screen. So please continue to share your questions.
What's our next question,
the next
Isabel?
question is, okay, the next question is about columns.
What columns are automatically detected by Empower? So the ones that are detected by Empower are either the E-Chord columns available for the Acuity series of instruments, or the new E-Connect columns that are available with the new Alliance IS. Those columns are automatically detected by Empower, and the information that is collected is permanently stored. And while I didn't necessarily show it, although it's in one of the screen captures, it will collect beyond the name, the serial number, the part number. You'll have the maximum temperature to date, maximum pressure to date, how many injections you made on that column, and so forth and so on. So there's quite a bit of information that's stored. But those are the two that would automatically be detected by Empower.
Excellent. Thank you, Neil.
Okay.
The next
Thank you for that question. What do we have next?
Okay, so the next question is about custom calculations. And what is the best way to export 2D, 3D chromatography results to...
Thank you, Neil. Regarding custom calculations, what is the best way to export 2D, 3D chromatography results to .txt format in cases? So the export method has several formats that you can actually export in. And then there are formats that you can import data in as well. So just very quickly, I'm going to answer your question. So it depends what you want to export. Do you want to export raw data? Do you want to export already processed fields of information? Do you want to export a report? There's several different things. So for raw data, you have the ability to export in ASCII or AIA format. If it's a table of information, you could export it in ASCII format as well. And you can export individual results, or you can do a summary of results. And for reports, you have EMF, ASCII, and PDF. So I think for raw data, it's really a choice of ASCII and or AIA.
Thank you, Neil. We have more questions about...
That's a great question. Thank you.
We have more questions about columns.
Next.
So the next question is about columns. If columns are not automatically detected, could we manually add column information into the system?
If columns are not automatically detected, could we manually add column information into the system? Absolutely. There are already 2 default fields that are built into the sample set method in Empower. And one is the column name and one is the serial number. And the column name is actually a sample custom field with a list. So if you create a sample set method and you click in the first cell for that field, a list pops out. Now, of course, the list is all waters columns, but you can change that. You can modify that. You can edit the list. You can either take away or add more columns to it. And then the serial number field would be, you would enter the serial number. So there are 2 fields already built in, column name and serial number. But if you needed more information, you could create sample custom fields to enter that. So again, maybe you want to put in the part number or the particle size or something like that. You could create sample custom fields for those additional pieces of information. Okay,
Great.
good, thank you.
And we have more
Let's have our
column
next
questions.
question, please.
The column question, you spoke about tags, column tags that allow like the detection of columns. The
Will there
question
ever be
is,
a potential to add an E-tag to non-waters columns for tracking purposes? Many people have asked this question. I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. I know that the people in our chemistry group are looking at technologies for the future. I don't know what that is just yet. I wish I could give you an answer, but you're not alone because I've had that question many times, even going back to the time when we introduced the E-cord in the early days of the Acuity instruments. So all I can say is stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have some answers soon. Thank you.
All right, next question. How can we set up a sample set template?
How can we set up a sample set template that mandates analysts to enter column serial number before each time testing? So what you can do is you can make that column serial number, it's a custom field, you can make entry mandatory. All right, so when you create the custom field or if you modify the custom field, there is a tick box that you can check to make it a mandatory entry. So that if you have somebody that goes in to run samples and they don't put the serial number in and they click the run button, a message is going to pop up right at that field saying entry is mandatory. And the instrument will not start injecting until they fill that out. So that's how you would do that. You can make that custom field a mandatory entry. Good question. Thank you.
Great. The next one is actually more of an alliance question.
What's next? Could you please describe again what does flow-through needle and how much improvement we get by IS? I don't know that I am the best person to answer that. There are flow-through needles and there are fixed loop injectors and different types of injectors. Unfortunately, that's not my area of expertise. I know that the reproducibility with the older Alliance that has a flow-through needle is quite good, and that's why we proceeded with the Alliance IS with a flow-through needle. What those improvements are, I don't know. However, I will have your question and your email, and I promise to get back to you with an answer on that once I speak to some of the folks in the instrument group. So I'll get back to you by email. Good question.
Excellent. And those are all the questions that we have. So hopefully you can, I understand that some of you have a hard time.
We have time for a few more questions. What's next?
We actually were done with questions, Neil. So we're going to wrap up. There is one question that keeps coming up is, can we get access to the presentation? Actually, there is one more that I'm going to send to you.
We have?
Yeah, let's use this one. Is there any reason for a typical lab to use traditional integration instead of Apex track?
Okay, this is a good one. Well, they're all good ones. I don't want to bias anything. Is there any reason for a typical lab to be using traditional integration instead of Apex track? That's a great question. There are some cases for people doing either GPC, gel permeation chromatography, or size exclusion chromatography, where you're looking at the molecular weight distribution of polymers. There are some integration events for forcing the baseline either forward or reverse that only exist in traditional and not in apex track. So in those cases, some customers will use the traditional algorithm. Now, I've looked at GPC data, older data versus new data. I've used both algorithms, and it really depends on what the chromatography looks like. I have seen some cases where you do need those integration events, and that's where traditional becomes important. So yeah, there are those cases where traditional is needed. Thank you. It's a good question.
So Neil, I hope you can hear me. I understand you could not hear me before. We're going to wrap up. This is the last. This is the last question. So thank you. One question that comes up a lot is, do we have access? Can we have access to the presentation? So you will have access to the PDF
we have time
copy
for at
of
least
the
one
presentation
more question.
and the recording. And with that, I will invite you to complete the survey on the right-hand side of the screen. And I will give you just a few seconds to do that. That brings us to the end of our webinar
that
session.
Is the last one.
It sounds like Neil, you cannot hear me. I'm sorry
we're having
about
a little
that.
bit of technical problems, so I must apologize because I cannot hear my colleague Isabel.
I think we're done.
Any other questions that we might address?
No, that's it, Neil. So I'm going to thank all of you, and I'm going to thank Neil.
So if we missed any of the questions, I do promise to get back to you with an email and an answer to your question, particularly that one about the flow-through needles. So I've made note of that. Okay.
Thank you, Neil. That'd be great.
All right.
Thank you all.
Well, if that's the last question, then I thank you for your attention. I hope you found it useful. And I will leave it to Isabel to make the concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, Neil. And I'm sorry you could not hear me. Yes, so I invite you to complete the survey on the right-hand side. Your feedback is very valuable to us. I thank you all for your great questions. And thank you, Neil, for the great presentation and the answers. You will receive within 48 hours an email with the link to the recording of the webinar, and we will include a PDF copy of the slides. I know that was a question that several of you have asked. I hope you find the webinar helpful and valuable. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.